Thank you. So today I'm going to be giving you an incredibly pessimistic and painful talk that I think we need to hear. But if you don't want pessimism and painful messages, then I won't be offended if you leave now. I think we've learned in computer science, and actually it was a keynote at Scale just about 3 or 4 years ago, about getting comfortable with failure and understanding when you failed at something that's a human thing to do, and destigmatizing our failures is really important to understand what we need to do correctly going forward. So this talk's going to be mostly about various failures that we've had in the 30 or so years I've been doing open source and free software activism and promotion and advocacy. I don't have that many solutions for this, but I'm going to at least state the problem clearly. And I was told by my graduate advisor that at the master's level, when you do a master's thesis, all you need to do to graduate is state a problem clearly. And a PhD level, you have to solve an open research problem, or at least make an attempt to solve an open research problem. So this is a master's level talk, not a PhD level talk. I'm not presenting a solution. I'm presenting a problem, hopefully, clearly. I am older than I used to be. I'm older than I ever been, and now I'm getting older, and now I'm older still. I was at Scale in 2005, my first one. I haven't been to every one. I tend not to come unless they accept my talks, which they do like 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 5 times. They can't have me speak every year, but I've attended lots of other FOSS events as well, many times. I counted up, and I've given about 150 talks on FOSS, and I've been really lucky to have somehow turned being an activist into a career, which I wouldn't have imagined would be possible that you could do that for a career. I thought I was going to have to take some job I hated, writing proprietary software. I was pretty depressed in my 20s for that reason. But somehow I got hired to be a FOSS activist in 1999, and that's been my career all this time. It's not at 20 yet, because it's OX19, so it's not at 2.0 yet. But I will be 2.0 years in FOSS Advocacy next year. But I am OX32 this year. You can do the math against my year of birth to figure out that it's not really a big milestone, OX32. It's 3.2. I mean, it's divisible by 16, there's that. But and I hereby declare myself the older generation, right? I think it's very strange for me because age creeps up on you, right? And it's about percentages of life, right? So you think of a baby, right? They're 1 year old. The next year, that's half their life. That's a long time. Half your life is a long time. And as you get older, the percentage of your life that 1 year is becomes less and less. And that's why, when you're waiting in line behind an old person, they're not in a hurry because, it's a smaller percentage of their life at that point. And I'm starting to get like that. I take a long time at the store now. Like, I used to be the person behind me annoyed that I was taking too long talking to the cashier. I want to start out with kind of what the principles that I come from are, because these principles are not so much in favor as they once were in open source and free software. I generally would probably call myself a free software extremist in that I believe that people should have a fundamental right to copy, share, modify, redistribute, improve, reinstall modified versions of their software. And I've had, and you may have seen my talks at Scale before, where I've talked about many of my experiences, you can find them online, that convinced me of this. And this is a belief, not a fact. I believe this is the right way to organize a society around software, and we, in many ways, every day, more and more, we are a society organized around software. Most people in this room are using software right now, literally. And I think there's also a fundamental, and this is something I've come to more recently, consumer rights component to open source and free software. The right for consumers to have control of their own software is incredibly important in a society where most of the products are software or incorporate software in some way as a fundamental part of the product. And so not only as I believe it as a moral right and freedom that people should have, I think there's a consumer rights component that's incredibly important. And from my point of view, I got really depressed when I was Now I'm going to challenge myself to convert from hex to, I'm not going to do it. When I was in my mid-20s in decimal, because I've been a computer scientist for 30 years, I can't convert from decimal to hex in my head. I admit it. I did all that, but, with a calculator. I'm in my 20s and early 30s, I got very worried, because I thought that we were going to have a free software world in my lifetime. That we were doing this free software thing. It was becoming popular, through open source, and I was like, this is great. We're going to have 100% free software world. All software is going to be free software in my lifetime. And as I got into the mid 2000s, I realized that's not the case. I'm going to die in a world with proprietary software in it, and I hope I die just slightly slowly, because I want my last words to be, as I die, oh, but I die in a world with proprietary software, so that people in the generations from now can quote me on that. I don't know if you know this, but Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were competing with each other to try both to die on the 4th of July. It's an interesting historical fact. And they were sending letters back and forth when they were sick, like trying to time their death, and then one of them wanted to die before the other. It's a very funny story. Because they were thinking of history. They were thinking of the multi-generational aspect that the United States was going to be, and I think our cause is a multi-generational cause as well. And I don't think it's worth doing without these long-term goals. I wouldn't do all this work that I do if I was fighting for a world that was partially free software. So I thought a lot about activism that came before. I was kind of a student of the movements of the 1960s, particularly against the Vietnam conflict, and I felt very strongly that I'd almost missed my opportunity to be part of what seemed like a groundswell that was happening in the late 1960s. This is interesting because it's a quote from, it's often quoted, and I went digging for the source because I didn't know. This was became a very popular saying during the particularly the student movements during the 1960s, to say never trust anybody over 30. That somehow, and I think there is some accuracy to this, that people who are part of the incumbent power structure around you, basically old white cis men, they're inherently difficult to trust because they have a vested interest in keeping the system the way that it is, particularly if they're wealthy. And so that's where this kind of thing is coming from. But it's interesting to note, while this fellow, Jack Weinberg, spent a life of activism, he did some interesting things, some of them controversial, but he's now in his 80s. So he's now, many, many years out from who he said he was going to trust when he was in his 20s. But I was so inspired by the peace movement of the 60s and as a teenager. And I felt, really, when I got into free software advocacy, I really was like, well, this is about peace, love, and understanding. This is about people working collaboratively together to develop software. At the time I got involved, it was primarily developed by hobbyists. Companies wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't allow people to install open source software in the 1990s in their companies. It was banned, and people who did it got fired. So there was also this thing going on in the press that we were being called communists. If you do a net search for my name and search for communism, you'll find an article in Forbes in the early 2000s talking about how my work doing enforcement of copyleft licenses was this communist plot that I was involved with. And Forbes published this thing on their online edition. In those days, 2003-ish timeframe, the online edition was not really serious. So that was probably why they published it. But hey, it's still there on the internet under Forbes.com. Now, I wasn't that interested in communism as a young person. When I was a teenager, I would have considered myself an anarchist, and I like to say that I dabbled in anarchy as a teen. I wasn't that sophisticated about it. I didn't read the right books. Like, I was just basically into punk rock, and punk rock was telling me how anarchy could be a better system that would fight the capitalist incumbent power structures, and I was pretty swayed by it. I remember getting an album in the 1983-84 timeframe by a band called The Exploited. It's a British punk band. And the title album and the front track was Punk's Not Dead, which I've realized now, if you have to say that your movement is not dead and make that the key message you're saying, your movement may in fact be in peril. And we spent the whole 80s debating whether punk was dead or not. I don't know if the jury is back yet on when punk exactly died. However, I'm pretty sure it's dead now, and here's why. This image right here, so I searched "Punk's Not Dead" as an image search online. This was the first image that came up. This image, in fact, is not from, I was originally going to use the cover of the Exploited album, but it doesn't say the words "Punk's Not Dead." So I found this, I was like, this is a great image. I click on it. This image is, in fact, a proprietary image from the Adobe clip art system. And I am hereby announcing that this slide is infringing Adobe's copyright. And I would like them to sue me over putting this "Punk's Not Dead" and anarchy symbol on a slide. But the fact that you can make money selling clip art of that probably mean punk's dead. But it was an interesting movement to be a part of as a teenager, right? Because I didn't have to do anything except like yell at my parents, right? Because that's all you're supposed to do as a teenager. And it felt like I was part of something. And for those of you who weren't around in the 1980s, which probably is most of you, there was this really heavy push. There was this new technology that came out called cassette tapes. Now, if you don't know what a cassette tape is, I have to go back and tell you what a record is. So there were these things called records, which were the way we got music, like in the 70s, from the 70s into the early 80s, and they were a write-once medium. You could record something on them, but you couldn't re-record on them, at least without a large piece of equipment to repress the record. So the cassette tape, first an 8-track. 8-track was a form of cassette before there was cassettes. It's the VHS and beta, which I'm going to explain later because you probably don't know what that is either. But the cassette industry was directly opposed to the recording industry in this really interesting way in the 1980s. Because we had this system where people had lots of records, and the Recording Industry Association of America, RIAA, which as far as I know is based not too far from here in the Los Angeles area, basically launched a campaign to convince people that the cassette tape industry was destroying music entirely. And this was like the key kind of image of their campaign, that home taping is just destroying the future of music, because there won't be any music if you don't pay the Recording Industry Association of America for music every time you listen to it, then there will be no music anymore ever. People in the punk world were very against this. This is the backside of a cassette tape. This is what the cassette tapes look like for those of you who are younger in the audience. This was the backside of an EP, and I won't explain why it was still called an EP, even though it was a cassette, because that's a term from records, but those of us who were around then know why. But because it was an EP, it didn't need both sides of the cassette to have the music that you wanted to listen to. Only the front side of the cassette. Oh, cassettes had two sides. You could turn them over and play something different. Forgot to mention that. And the side two was left blank. This is an album by the Dead Kennedys, which is led by a guy named, who's not real name, Jello Biafra is his punk name. And I got this, I went to my record store and I bought this, and I followed the instructions. I was like, yes! And so I started recording other bands on side two that I wanted. When my friend had a recording that I wanted of some band I didn't have that album, I could record it onto this thing. And that was, I thought I was doing my part to fight the RIAA. Like sharing music, sharing your ideas and your art is a good thing. And so, because I'd always kind of seen myself as an, I'm sorry, before I move on. So what ended up happening eventually is I became this job as a FOSS activist, and then I had the opportunity to go to see Jello Biafra, the lead singer of the Dead Kennedys, who was now doing mostly talks, spoken word albums. I got to meet him. And so I got in line for the meet and greet. For those of you who've been to shows, they still do this, as it turns out, meet and greets. It's still a thing, surprisingly enough. So I got in line for the meet and greet. It's like 2002-ish. And I finally got to the front, and I'm so proud, because remembering how this side of I'm not going to say the name of the album because it's probably violates the code of conduct, but side two of that album was, I had done this, and I couldn't wait to tell Jello, like, I did this, and I got up there and I said, I'm so excited to meet you. The punk movement and your work was an inspiration to me. I now do a lot of work really fighting against the incumbent power structures of copyright holders in the software industry who are using it to keep people from sharing software in the same way people were keeping us from sharing music. And Jello looks at me and says, oh, that sounds horrible, because if I couldn't copyright my spoken word and music and have people pay me for the albums, I would have to tour all the time. I wouldn't get enough money to be able to live. So that sounds pretty horrible to me. I really believe in strong copyright and the ability to sell your art and stop people from copying it. The same guy who made the decision to put that on side 2. So never meet your heroes. And ever since that happened, I started to think about, am I really an activist, right? Is this an activist movement anymore at all? Am I a relic of it? Am I just part of the problem at this point? I believed most of my career as a free software activist that I was part of a disruptive, radical social justice movement to change the way software operated and make sure that people had certain rights in their software. But I hope I have done that. I'm not really sure exactly. And I think a lot about those days of being a teenage punk kid. And I'm sort of, I call it a blessing and a curse that I have a very good memory. I particularly have a very good memory for my own thoughts and feelings. I don't have kids, but I'm pretty good with kids because I see a kid of a given age and I remember exactly how I felt and what I thought at that age, at least from 8 up. And so I can remember exactly what teenage me would say to me now, and teenage me would say I was a sellout conformist, being part of this, this horrible software industry and making money being an activist because I should be a volunteer as an activist because making money as an activist is wrong, and I can sort of imagine what that conversation would be like. Now, my teenage self is an idiot, so don't listen to him, but because all teenagers are, after all. But if you look at some adult maturity, this is what I really want to get to and leave you with in this talk, that there are some serious mistakes and failures and compromises that we made in FOSS Advocacy as time went on for the last 30 years, that in hindsight at least, we can look back and see that there were problems. And I think the reason those problems are there is because the line between making a reasonable compromise with your political opposition and selling out is pretty blurry. It's never clear, except by hindsight, if you sold out or made a reasonable compromise that pushed forward the movement. Because, of course, we wouldn't be able to do free software unless we occasionally made coalition decisions to work with for-profit companies in the capitalist structure because they exist and they control most of the world. And if we just refused to talk to them and say that they were our enemy and tried to fight them without ever cooperating with them, we would almost certainly fail. So we spent a lot of years kind of making deals with capitalism. And I think one of my biggest concerns about where we went too far was the level to which libertarian, unbridled capitalism was kind of a central part of the 98 to 2002 era of open source advocacy with companies. You hear other people in the FOSS world make this big distinction between free software and open source, and I don't think the words matter so much as the ideas behind it. And the big difference really is that kind of stuff that started in 1998 was really to just turn free software into something companies could consume. And I think there was a tremendous pressure to convince ourselves and everyone else that free software was basically a pro-capitalist type of system. I found talks that I gave in that era where I'm sort of telling people that don't worry, you can get rich doing free software. People have gotten really wealthy doing free software. And I think we just really kowtowed to it in the early days in this way that I think has set us up pretty badly. And the reason why is because while we were focused on individual freedoms and rights, this idea that you get a device, whatever it is, it could be a mobile device, it can be a laptop, it can be a server, it doesn't matter what it is. Once you get possession of that device, you as an individual should have certain ability to modify, study, change, reinstall the software on it. But companies realized that given their large amount of power and large amount of funding, that they could make use of these rights and freedoms in a much more efficient and powerful way. And I, for one, am sick of the invisible hand of the market slapping me in the face over and over again. Because I think that's what's tended to happen in open source, is that the incumbent power structures of big tech and capitalism have been able to utilize open source and free software for their own benefit. And while they talk a good game about giving back, and they've coined this term sustainability, which has absolutely nothing to do with environmental sustainability, it has to do with paying people to work on open source, but they're only willing to pay for the types of open source in the frameworks that they decide, on the projects that they decide, under the licenses that they decide. And so this hobbyist aspect of open source and free software, which is really where it came from. When you look at the earliest projects like Linux itself, for example, it began and spent most of its lifetime, its early lifetime anyway, the first 10 years or so, in relative obscurity. Now, I want to talk a little bit about copyleft. I just want to get a show of hands. How many of you want me to cover what copyleft is versus non-copyleft licenses? I don't know the level of knowledge. Is there anybody here who wants me to cover that? Or will get lost if I start talking about copyleft versus non-copyleft? Nobody raised their hand, so I'm going to throw this slide up and just let you read it real quick, and then I'll move on just so you, because I'm about to get into licensing, because it's me giving a talk, so like you know what you came for. You're going to get some licensing stuff. The watershed moment for me, when I really understood what was happening with regard to corporate influence over open source, was at this moment at OSCON 2013. So this is Tom Preston Warner. He's one of the founders of GitHub. He was forced out of the company in disgrace over a scandal that was not actually resolved, and GitHub has never apologized for it. And then later, GitHub was bought by Microsoft. Microsoft hasn't apologized for it. He admittedly is 3 CEOs ago now. But he bought a keynote at OSCON, because that's what you do, because once, like, not a conference like Scale, of course, that's community organized, but these corporate conferences, the companies would come buy keynotes to talk to the open source community. And one of the keynotes that was bought by GitHub was given by, instead of talking about GitHub at all, he spent his entire keynote talking about how evil the GPL is, and that people shouldn't release software under the GPL, because it has restrictions in it, in his framing. Of course, these things that he calls restrictions were the guarantees for the public's rights. It was the guarantees to consumers that they would have a right to modify and improve the software. But by framing it this way, and by what was really an uncoordinated conspiracy, it wasn't an actual conspiracy where a bunch of big companies sat in a room together and said, let's destroy copyleft. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it turned out that around this time, it was clearly in the interest of every major corporation involved in open source to discredit copyleft, all for their own unrelated reasons, mostly. And they were relatively successful. Most developers you meet today tend to have a belief that if they release their software under a copyleft license, quote, no one will ever use it, unquote. Linux is an obvious counterexample. I usually ask such people if they use Linux or not and tell them they should stop if they don't like copyleft immediately and install NetBSD or FreeBSD. But that is the type of belief in the community that these very powerful people were able to put into place over a period of years with lots of well thought out strategy that we were not answering very well. Because we were still on the message, FOSS activists and particularly copyleft advocates, saying, oh, well, there's a place for every type of license, and non-copyleft licenses have their place, and it's still free software, which is all true, of course. But I, for one, now say non-copyleft software is part of the problem. We need less of it. We need fewer people to choose non-copyleft license. We need more people to choose copyleft licenses, because copyleft is our last round of defense for the hobbyist developer. It is all we have left, given how much companies have taken over the open source world. The other thing that we did that was really problematic in hindsight, but at the time I thought was like the right kind of rhetoric, was we kept talking over and over again about how the copyleft itself and just free software in general had this equal footing between commercial and non-commercial actors. That, and particularly because of copyleft, you'd have people who were contributing who were hobbyists, you had people contributing companies, they were all bound by the copyleft license, and then somehow this was like a constitution of the community. I used to give talks where I compared the GPL to a constitution of the community. The thing that argument misses is the amount of resource, when they want to, that companies can put into a project and take it over, and take control even of copylefted projects. And the thing that we never really thought about was that copyleft, while a wonderful tool, which I'm still a huge fan of, I still spend most of my work, as I have for the last 20 years, doing copyleft enforcement. But even I will admit, copyleft is a necessary but not sufficient tool to assure software freedom. So your first step has to be to copyleft the project, but there's a whole host of other things that we need to do in free software projects to assure that they don't fall under the control of capitalism in general and become simply tools for companies to use for their own benefit. Another thing that I think companies were incredibly savvy to do, and I'm so impressed from just a political strategist point of view when I step back from it, that they were able to do this, was that over the last 15 years, companies have done an incredible job at literally co-opting the word foundation, such that when you hear about some open source foundation, it is usually a 501c6 trade association. And they were very good at saying things like, well, the tax status doesn't matter. Don't think about the tax status. That's just for tax lawyers and tax geeks and C6. And in fact, Jim Zemlin, who's the head of the Linux Foundation, he's fond of saying, well, 501c6s are always twice as good as 501c3s because 3 times 2 is 6. He's literally said that multiple times. And that's as far as they'll go to talk about the difference in structure. Now, the interesting thing about the difference in structure is that there is power in these systems that the government has had for, at this point, hundreds of years to create different types of nonprofit entities. And 501c3s have this interesting aspect to them, which is they are required, under penalty of losing their corporate status, being dissolved by the government, they are required to act in the public good. And I work for a 501c3 called the Software Freedom Conservancy, and we are required. I do love that my job every morning is to get up and try to act in the public good, and if I fail, I get fired. Like, that's the exact incentive I wanted in my career. A 501c6 is designed to put forward the common business interest of the companies who pay to be members of the 501c6, which means that common business interest has nothing to do with consumers. It has nothing to do with hobbyists. It has nothing to do with open source and free software. It has to do whatever they think is in their common business interest. And most of the organizations you'll find that will tell you over in the expo hall they're a nonprofit, I encourage you to ask them, are you a 501c3 or C6? And if they say they're a 501c6, ask them, who are your corporate controllers? Who controls you? Who tells you what you have to do? Because you're just a trade association pursuing a common business interest. But very few people want to dig down on that because it sounds like a bunch of IRS geekiness. But what was amazingly disturbing was that these various different trade associations were able to establish it like these are community organizations. Another thing that happened that I really didn't predict and is pretty concerning is that this idea that all the methodologies and work we were doing to make free software development better was going to itself get co-opted. I remember sitting at a Usenix conference in the late 90s, it was mid-90s, and the BSD code had just been released. There was this big lawsuit over the BSD code, and finally, much of it, kind of in pieces, was released under the BSD license. AT&T finally relinquished and settled. And the BSD project was getting going. And they were sitting up on the panel talking about things that we've long since solved. They were saying, we've got developers all over the world. We don't know how to coordinate. We're sending tapes back and forth. Like, not everybody has an internet connection. They can't connect and get into our projects. And then somebody makes a change over here, and I make a change over here. And when we put it in RCS, we have all these conflicts, and we don't know what to do. And these are this list of problems in FOSS development that they were facing. Now, you all know those problems I just listed off because they're all solved problems today for FOSS development. However, companies said, well, you know what? Those are not just good solutions for FOSS, they're good solutions for proprietary software development. In fact, if we take everybody in our big corporation and treat them like a FOSS developer, but the only rule is don't share the software with anybody who doesn't work here, but it's okay to share it with somebody in another department and all that sort of stuff. They've discovered, hey, wait, we can develop much, much better proprietary software much, much more quickly if we use this thing called inner source. I posit that inner source is just co-option of FOSS development to write proprietary software. And I'm so aghast at it. I get so lambasted by a lot of my colleagues that I've worked with for decades. There's one colleague who I won't mention by name who's really into this inner source thing, who just is, if this person sees this slide, they're going to be giving me a hard time in the booth later. But the fact of the matter is that I never got into this to make proprietary software development better. I asked the question, how many of us did? How many of us said, you know what, I really want a great distributed version control system so that people all over the world can write proprietary software faster and better. That's what we need, DVCS for proprietary software. I don't think any of us wanted that, or were chasing that. But Git, in the end, is used more by proprietary software companies than free software projects now, because there's just more proprietary software being developed than free software. Another thing I think we got wrong is being obsessed with free as in freedom over free as in price. I'm fond of saying that I came to free software for the free as in price and I stayed for the free as in freedom. It makes a cute piece of rhetoric, but looking back, the fact that it was free as in price, the fact that it had this egalitarian nature that anybody, regardless of their income level, if they had a computer, they could get involved in free software because the free software was free as in price, was in fact a really important aspect. Now, I'm not saying we should change the licenses to be non-commercial use only, nothing like that. I'm just saying that the upstream version, the fact that it's free as in price, even though the license doesn't technically require it to be free as in price, is one of these necessary conditions that is beyond the license that we have to think about. In fact, when I fantasize about time travel a lot, I guess I should come out about that. This is one of my favorite movies. I saw it when I was 10 years old, and I'm still a little obsessed with it. And this is the scene when, in Back to the Future, when Marty writes his letter to Doc. Spoiler alert, that he writes a letter so that Doc can know the future. I won't say more than that because it is a spoiler. But he's writing this letter, and I've thought about writing this letter, not necessarily to a second party, but to myself. What would I write about this whole issue of this free as in price thing? Like, what would I write? And I think what I would probably try to write is something like this. By 2023, most of the software people use every day, the individual consumer, I'm not talking about big companies and business software, I'm talking about individual user software. Most of the software is going to be free as in price, even though it's proprietary. And the way that it's going to be funded is through advertising and data mining of consumers. I could never have predicted that was going to happen, even as late as like 2007, 2008. It wasn't clear to me that the Google model was going to become the default model of all software everywhere. That the software industry would become basically the advertising industry. I'm very fond of this quote, which is ironically said by a venture capitalist, which is, I saw the best minds of my generation figure out how to get people to click on ads. And I look at my colleagues who have gone on to have actual careers in computer science, which I admit that though I'm classically trained in computer science, I'm not presenting computer science here, I'm presenting politics, if anything else. But my friends and colleagues who went on to their computer science careers, that's mostly what they do. Writes proprietary software to figure out how to get people how to click on ads. On the other hand, if I imagine writing this letter myself, it's rather pointless. It's actually, this thought experiment has convinced me that time travel is probably not that useful, and in fact, it has that aspect that's not in Back to the Future, by the way, but many other science fiction time travel stories where the characters consistently keep going back in time, and they are unable to prevent the event from happening because it just happens in a different way. This thought experiment's kind of convinced me that may be how, if time travel in the past, which has not been ruled out, but probably doesn't happen, but if it were to happen, I think it's one of these situations where you go back and you try to kill Hitler, and then somebody else becomes Hitler, right? I think we can't go back and do that because I don't know what I'd tell myself. What would I tell myself to do? I'd be like, this is all going to happen. Now, free software should do X to prevent it. I do not know, even if I had millions of dollars in resources, what I would have done to prevent this from happening to the software industry. Another really dangerous thing we did is we conceded completely on the digital restrictions management issue in a really fundamental way that really surprises me. Seth Schoen, who at the time worked for the EFF, was the first person to tell me back in 2002 that the rhetoric of the MPAA at the time was kind of mirroring that taping is destroying the recording industry message of the 1980s from the RAA. This idea that DRM was going to be inevitable, that every device would have digital restrictions management on it, that the MPAA would convince the entire tech industry, and they were telling activists that, give up. They literally said to people who were activists in that space, you should give up because this is going to happen. I was among the people who pretty arrogantly thought that any software developer who was any good would never dare write a DRM system. They would never create and help create DRM. I never imagined that cryptographers would look at DRM seriously and say, this is what cryptography should be used for. We should find a way to lock people's computers down so they can't do anything on them. All the cryptographers I knew were good computer scientists. No good computer scientist wants a machine locked down, but I realized that there's a lot of diversity of opinion in the world, and there are plenty of great computer scientists who are absolutely glad to help create some of the most inventive and disturbingly effective DRM systems in the world. I spent a lot of time in the early 2000s fighting this thing called the broadcast flag. Now, for those of you that are younger in the audience, there used to be this thing called broadcast television. And what would happen is they send the show, instead of coming off your internet connection, they send the show over a really broad base over the air. And it's not like Wi-Fi. It's not an actual data signal. Well, it is a data signal, sort of. But it's the only thing it is the actual television program. So instead of having your internet connection, which delivers your television programs, you can get these television programs over the air. It was very common in the 1950s, 1960s, and so forth. So by 2002, they decided to switch that signal from being analog to digital. And as part of that, the MPAA and various other powerful copyright-holding entities in the television and movie and music world got together and said, well, you know what? We're going to mandate the industry create something called a broadcast flag. Every signal for every television program and movie that goes to people's TVs will have a bit. And if we turn that bit on, every single device that can decode that signal must not allow the viewer to record the program. So all DVRs, all this stuff, they anticipated all of it and said, okay, stop them from recording. And we won against the broadcast flag. The broadcast flag was a dead-on-arrival proposal. The industry did not accept it. All of the DVRs that got made did not respect the broadcast flag. Technically, it's still in the HDTV signals out there in the world, but no one pays attention to it. And the thing is that we won, we celebrated, and that was the moment I stopped working on DRM. Other people worked on DRM longer, I know, but in the end, we all stopped working on DRM, but the MPAA didn't. And now, almost every program that people watch comes from a streaming service, which is 100% DRM'd. DRM was inevitable. And we didn't keep fighting it. Even worse, the W3C and Mozilla Foundation teamed up to deliver DRM to FOSS. And this is an interesting place where licensing would have helped. Firefox is under this thing called the MPL, which is a weak copyleft license, which means you're allowed to make proprietary software plugins for Firefox browser. If Firefox were under the GPL, you couldn't do that. And they gleefully welcomed the various different encryption and DRM standards into the W3C and then into Firefox. I mean, my spouse is happy about this because they can watch a Netflix broadcast on Firefox on a Linux box. So folks in the Linux world were like, hey, I'm a Linux user. I can watch Netflix now. Because I don't know if many of you remember this, but there was a time when the only people that would make a deal with Netflix about DRM was Microsoft. And you had to be on a Microsoft box with Silverlight to use Netflix. But fortunately for the DRM industry, Firefox delivered them the users on a silver platter. And it's very interesting that in the announcement Mitchell Baker made about this decision, she said she wanted to serve her users and give them DRM. And as I say, she served them on a silver platter right to the MPAA. So I mean, I can pick on folks who didn't do more that they could have done, but I can admit that circa 2004, I stopped working on DRM too. I wasn't thinking then about this whole thing, about taping and all that, and how important it was when I was a teenager. I didn't listen to my teenage self, who was probably telling me I was selling out by not working on DRM anymore. Maybe if I went back in time or wrote myself that letter, I would say work on DRM more. But again, I'm not sure what I would tell myself to do. I think DRM, in fact, was inevitable, and we just weren't together enough to fight it. I'm going to leave you with one last thought experiment. There is much power in collective action. We're finally reaching a point in my lifetime, which is really nice, that people are not anti-union by default. I spent most of my life hearing that unions and collective bargaining was some sort of conspiracy of people to make products expensive. And I believed it in my early days and found out that it was just, in fact, more of these wealthy capitalist corporations trying to convince people that they shouldn't have rights. So imagine, if you will, a worldwide union of software developers with a single demand. They say, none of us will write another line of proprietary software again for the rest of our careers. There will be no software written until you, the people with the wealth and the power and controlling all these big tech corporations, agree that we're only writing free software. It's a thought experiment because I don't think we'll ever get enough people to not cross the picket line to be that effective, at least not now. I'm fond of saying, though, that every idea is politically unviable until it's not. There are lots of things in our culture that 20 years ago were politically unviable that now are commonplace. When I was a young queer kid, I thought gay marriage was going to be politically unviable, and it's not. So it's possible for us to make changes. It's possible for us to do something different. And it's going to take some people to stand up and say something. I don't think that this is a particularly easy thing to do. I don't think it will happen in my lifetime. But I encourage folks to think about what we can do as software developers, as people working in the technology industry, to say, I'm not comfortable with proprietary software. I don't think it's ethical, and I don't really want to work on it. And be willing, as has been said in the past, and something that I really believe, be willing to not work in the software industry if you think it's unethical. That's kind of what led me to my career. I got very lucky. I know that I'm paid as a free software activist, and I get to live this dream where I can run a 100% free software laptop and nobody complains that I'm running a 15-year-old ThinkPad and my work doesn't require me to run a newer machine and all this sort of stuff, right? I have a lot of privilege in my life as somebody who gets paid to be a free software activist. But I think all of us can make a certain amount of change by just the most smallest pushback. You don't have to go on strike, but just bringing it up in a developer meeting of like, oh, we're not open sourcing that? Why? Tell me why. Explain to me why. We're choosing the BSD license or the MIT license, the Apache license instead of GPL? Why? I can't keep my own copyrights and license them under the GPL? Why? Why does it have to be work for hire? Why do I have to give all my copyrights over to the corporation and let you pick what the license is? Why shouldn't I have a say in what the license of the project is? These are the kinds of things I think that we could do. So I think in summary, I want to point out the biggest mistake certainly I made in free software advocacy is I thought we could ally ourselves with capitalism. I'm in the weird position of saying I was for it before I was against it. As a young teenager, as I've explained, I was pretty anti-capitalist. I would consider myself leaning towards pro-capitalist in my 20s and 30s, and I'm back to being pretty anti-capitalist. I think that there are serious problems with capitalism, and big tech in particular, that we're all too often in free software not willing to say that what big companies do is not really in the interest of individuals and consumers most of the time. And I hope we can swing back to being able to say that. And particularly, I'm talking about unbridled capitalism, this idea of a libertarian system where they follow their own golden rule, which is the person with the gold makes the rules. I was kind of swayed. I was raised Christian, but I'm an atheist now, but I really do like the correct golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have others do unto you. I think the GPL is a software license implementation of that golden rule. Finally, I think that the hobbyist culture is the reason any of this work to start. I'm noticed many events are taking Linux out of their name. I'm glad that Scale has not, at least yet. And I point to Linux and say that we spent at least a decade in the Linux community living in obscurity, and it moved along slowly but surely. And it was a hobbyist project. That history has been rewritten as if there were always companies dumping tons of money into Linux, and the only reason it was successful was because companies dumped money into it. It was already successful. Companies dumped money into Linux because they realized it was the most successful Unix-like operating system by the time they dumped money into it. And we made that as hobbyists, not as a corporate, for-profit open source culture. Anyway, I'll end with that. I think I've left a pretty good amount of time for questions. So one last thing I want to say, because our executive director would be annoyed me if I didn't. So I do work for one of these 501c3 charities that operates in the public good. We're at the very end of a process we began 10 years ago to move ourselves from being funded by companies to being funded by individuals, because we didn't want to be in a situation where we had influence by companies, and after all, if we kept going in that direction, we would fail our public support test. So we had a dozen reasons or more to switch to being an individually funded. It's $120 a year. It makes a difference. It does fund my work. The nice thing about funding a 501c3, my salary is public. In fact, my salary since 2000 has been made public all the time, so you can go online and read how much we're paid to do this work, and I hope you will support us in doing it. Thank you.
That was amazing. I'm glad I got assigned to this room.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
Questions? I'll run around with a microphone. Or walk fast.
So, given that we all have to pay rent, I'm curious, like, what business models or financial models have you seen that sort of align with these ideals, but also reflect the reality of, like, the world we live in where, you know, we got to pay rent at the end of the day?
So I think that I'm going to give you a non-answer and then hopefully an actual answer. I'll start with the non-answer. The non-answer is, I think that's one of the errors that we would fall into. When I would get asked this question, in talks 15, 20 years ago, I'm back in decimal, but my hex is bad, I apologize. But I would immediately answer with a whole list of like all these business models that you could do, and here's how to make money with free software. I'm at the point now where I'm saying, maybe you can't make money with free software. Maybe it won't make you rich. I don't know. But I do think where we are now, where we focus the idea that the software industry is this VC-based system where people insist on raising hundreds of millions of dollars to fund a bunch of developers to write things very, very fast to disrupt the marketplace. I hope that model is dying. Given news about their banking, perhaps it is, and that's a good thing in some sense. But that's the non-answer. The real answer is, I imagine when I started as a free software activist that we would have large amounts of small companies, because I think that fits very well with the free software model, and the GPL is basically ready-made as a license to assure that small companies can collaborate together. And if you look at a company like Igalia, which is based in Spain, now, it's sort of a cheat because they're mostly writing software, they're getting software contracts from bigger companies that need some open source change done to some project. But they've been able to never have to write any proprietary software themselves, per se. They don't GPL everything. They license a lot of stuff under LGPL to be able to get that done and serve their customers. But I believe there is opportunities for smaller operations to fund yourself and a few other people. I think that there's a lot of places where incumbent proprietary software systems are still making people's lives miserable. My mother, before she died, was a medical secretary and handled billing. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of proprietary software medical. I know why you're raising your hand, Remy. Of these proprietary billing systems and so forth for medicine, and I think there's a huge opening for open source development there. I adopted my dogs, who have both passed away now, from a rescue. It was a very large dog rescue. They had this giant software system, all proprietary, that somebody had sold them, and it was clearly custom built because it had like their needs met. Like, there was no reason that couldn't have been open source, right? And then other dog rescues would have used it. No one bothered to pitch it as open source to them. So I think there are a lot of, if you're an entrepreneur, I think there are opportunities there. Most startup initiatives fail. I think it's the usual number is 70% of initiatives you try fail when you try to start a business. But I do think there are opportunities to do. I think at this point it's more about asking questions. And I want to double down on this idea that you're not required to work in the software industry, right? I mean, I've recently been trying to expand my social circle and making friends who don't have skills in software, because I spent the last 30 years of my life making friends with people who are involved in software. And a lot of them are not well off, but they make a living not doing software. And so intelligent people can find jobs. And so boycotting the entire process may be an option. It's certainly what I did, and I got really lucky, as I said, to being able to do what I do. But it started from that principle of, I'm not going to write proprietary software. Okay, I'm not going to support proprietary software. What am I going to do with my life? And eventually, opportunities presented themselves. So I think there is some opportunity out there. And we also have to collectively get a little uncomfortable with capitalism and say that maybe our society shouldn't be built around the idea of the most important thing you have to do is desperately try to make money. And I know that because of the way the world is, that if you're poor, it's a very scary thing. But I think most people who would have an opportunity to work in the software industry writing proprietary software probably are not in a situation where they're at risk of being destitute if they don't write that proprietary software.
So thank you for the talk, Bradley, as always. My question is, we heard a lot about for-profit, we heard a lot about nonprofit. What about the public sector? Where do you think that the public sector fits into the free software movement? Were there any sort of moments in the timeline you'd write a letter about for now or in the future?
So I think that I could have, if I made the talk longer, I could have actually had a section about that. Maybe when I give this in the future, I'll talk with you and figure out how to bring that up. I do think we failed to do the kind of advocacy we needed to in the public sector. I recall there was this government and open source conference that started running very early on in like 2001, and then it kind of came and went. And there was multiple attempts to get it going again. I don't know if it still runs, but it never got extremely large, because you think by now the government and open source conference would run every year in DC, and it would have tens and 20s of thousands of attendees at this point, and there's not really that. I think, to be frank about it, to talk about the elephant in the open source room, the Linux Foundation has really kind of honed in on sort of explaining that they're the interface to governments. If you look at the recent cybersecurity meeting at the White House, I was aghast, right? So they call the cybersecurity meeting at the White House. They're going to bring in people to talk about how do we make sure open source is secure. GitHub and Microsoft are invited as separate entities, even though Microsoft owns GitHub and it's part of that, so that's really one. And then all the other people who showed up were all Linux Foundation members, and then the Linux Foundation showed up as a separate entity. So we're in this weird situation where, and this is in part because C3s can't do lobbying. We can, there's a very limited amount and you have to file for it. It's a little complicated for C3s to be able to lobby, whereas C6s are allowed to lobby as much as they want. So we have this kind of influence of the open source message from corporations is now to governments, and the US government in particular, we are selling you open source, like we're selling it to you, and it's a corporate product and so forth. I think it's backfiring one a little bit because that's kind of the security fear is why are you getting away with putting out these products that are from the government's mind insecure or have security problems that are unique, which we all know they're not really unique, but the government's currently kind of seeing it that way, that these open source security problems are unique. So I think it's a hugely complicated problem. I did my part by writing an open letter to Biden explaining all this, and I sent it directly to some of the people in his administration who organized that meeting. I didn't get a response, as you might expect. I think Remy, it's really, I mean, I'll be frank, people like Remy are the solution to this problem, right? Remy's working in the public sector doing great things to advocate for open source. So you should meet him and figure out what he needs to support his work. I think that's the real answer. I know you weren't fishing for that. That's why you're embarrassed, but it is correct. And we have good people like you who are trying to do it, but I'm sure you're facing all sorts of pushback and difficulties because there isn't really an interface between this activism. I don't think at least the US government doesn't understand that free software was about an activist thing to kind of change the industry. And the activists don't even have a seat at the table in these government conversations. So that's a tough problem, but I'm glad you're there.
Anybody else? Oh, we got one.
Thank you for the work of the Conservancy. Really important for my career, right? So broadly appreciate your work. You know, we're on the same side here. But I just feel like maybe you're making a sort of a category error in drawing the equivalency between what I heard from your talk as a moment of collective action around saying, hey, I'm going to refuse to do proprietary software work, which I'm hearing kind of from this hobbyist ideal or craft idealism, and the collective action of a strike of organized labor. Certainly there's a great and inspiring threads of idealism and craft idealism and committed, principled political idealism in the labor movement history, but there's also perhaps more threads of economic self-interest in the history of the labor movement. Perhaps more of it is about people who just want to make a dignified living, right? And so, you know, my dad was in a union. I'm making a comment. Is that okay or no?
Well, kind of, but maybe do a talk next year.
Okay. Hey, if that's not okay, I will pass the microphone back. Go ahead.
Do you have a question? Or?
No, I had a comment. I didn't have a question.
Okay.
Since there's no question, we can move on.
Hi, I really liked your talk, and just as someone who's part of, I guess, the younger next generation, I'm not familiar with a lot of this, and I just don't know the best way to learn the history since I wasn't able to live through it. Do you have any book recommendations or anything like that?
You know, it's a really huge problem. So we have this tradition. There's a lot of there's two things going on. One is all of this history is hidden in plain sight, right? Because so much of these kinds of discussion happen on public open mailing lists, of which the archives are still available, right? But the reason I say it's hidden in plain sight is that even when I remember something, because I have this, I'm blessed and cursed with this very good memory, I'm like, oh, I remember in 2003 there was a thread where they were discussing this, and when I research these talks, I spend hours trying to find that thread I know exists. I fortunately usually find it because I'm very into email indexing, so for this reason, because I use it as my secondary memory storage. But you're absolutely correct that there is not a well-written history of free software. You know, if I wasn't doing the work I was doing now, I would write the People's History of FOSS, right? Because we need that book. because the history is being written, but it's being rewritten by companies at this point who are writing, like the history of Linux is a great example, where if you go to, say, the Linux Foundation's website and try to learn the history of Linux, it sounds like a bunch of companies got together and paid Linus Torvalds to create an operating system, when in fact the first thing was, he was a student who of all things, posted an email message to a mailing list, said, I'm going to do this, it's just a hobby, not big and professional like GNU, which was itself a nonprofit. And so it's sort of like he saw himself in competition with the big hobbyist nonprofits, which is very interesting. And these kinds of history are not written down. So, I mean, I get that I should write this book, right, because it should exist for you. But I hope those, I mean, some of the folks in here were nodding. I mean, I hope you'll give your own talks about the history you remember. We do need kind of to move away from this oral history, hidden in plain sight method that we've been using to keep the history of free software. And it's kind of a hacker ethic problem. I remember talking to somebody a couple of years ago, I was like 10 years ago, and I was like, something they said, and I was like, well, I want to put that on my, on my website, because we actually made, to be frank about it, we made a bet about something, and I was like, well, I want to put it on my website that we have this bet so we don't forget. He goes, well, we have the IRC logs. I'm like, we will never remember that we took this bet about something by searching IRC logs, right? We got to memorialize it somewhere, and I think we do a lot of that. We're like, oh, it's all public, it's all in logs, like, and people, and it's kind of interesting because when you look at some of these companies, the way that they've adopted like the open source methods, they do everything with like public records and so forth, but there's so much data of all these meeting notes and all this sort of stuff that nobody ever bothers to figure out what they're going on. So they can get up there and talk, as we heard this morning, talk about open governance, and like, oh, we have all this open governance and so forth. But if it's not written in some sort of way that's digestible for the future, it really is not that open anymore, because it's just a bunch of data. You can't find actually what really happened.
We're at time.
Okay.